For 20 years, the townspeople of Cedar Creek snickered at Elena Vance and her broken-down gelding, Barnaby. A useless old woman clinging to a crippled horse, they'd say. She ignored them, tending to Barnaby's arthritic legs and fetching him fresh water even as her own body grew frail. Then came the night the dam up the valley failed, sending a wall of water toward the sleeping town. The only way to warn everyone in time rested on the shoulders and the legs of the two no one believed in. Elena Vance was 78 years old, a widow who had outlived everyone she loved except a horse that could barely walk. Barnaby was a rescue with fused joints and a permanent limp, the kind of animal even vets called a waste of feed. Together, they were the town joke, but in their quiet daily routine, they knew every hidden path through the valley, every shallow creek and safe ridge. When the dam burst at 2 in the morning, Cedar Creek had 12 minutes. And the only creature capable of navigating the flood in pitch darkness was the broken horse they had mocked for decades. The dam was called the Raven Creek Barrier, a concrete and earthen structure built in 1953 when Cedar Creek was still a coal town with a future. For 60 years, it had held back millions of gallons of water in a reservoir that fed the farms downstream. But by the spring of 2014, the dam had been flagged by 3 separate state inspections. Cracks in the spillway, erosion at the base. A report sat unread on a desk at the county engineer's office, stamped low priority. The people of Cedar Creek didn't worry, dams didn't fail, not here, not ever. Elena Vance knew the valley better than anyone. She had walked it for half a century, first with her husband, Charles, then alone after cancer took him in 1998. She had no children, no living siblings, and a dwindling circle of friends who had either passed away or moved into assisted living facilities 2 towns over. Her only constant companion was Barnaby, a chestnut gelding she found at a kill pen auction 17 years earlier, a bony, miserable creature with a knee injury that had calcified into a permanent hitch in his gait. He cost her $120 and a promise. Local kids called him Stumble. Farmers shook their heads when she led him through the fields, the two of them moving at a pace that made snails look hurried. At the Cedar Creek General Store, men gathered around the coffee pot would chuckle when Elena passed the window. "There goes the ghost and her wreck," Tom Hartley, the feed store manager, liked to say. He never said it to her face, but she heard it anyway. She heard all of it, and she filed it away in a quiet place where such things didn't matter. But while the town laughed, Elena and Barnaby were mapping the valley with a precision no surveyor could match. Every morning at dawn, she saddled him slowly, patiently, and they followed the deer trails that threaded through the forest above the reservoir. They crossed the shallow ford at Indian Creek before the water rose in spring. They climbed the rocky switchback that led to the old Fire Watch Tower, the highest point for miles. They learned which ridges stayed dry during the autumn floods and which hollows became death traps of mud and rushing water. Elena knew the sound the creek made when rain upstream was about to swell it. Barnaby knew the smell of shifting earth before a mudslide let loose. Together, they were a living map. The county had long stopped maintaining the backcountry trails. The official evacuation route from Cedar Creek was Highway 9, a 2-lane road that ran along the valley floor, parallel to the creek. But if Highway 9 were ever compromised, if the creek jumped its banks and washed out the road, the 1,200 residents of Cedar Creek would have no way out. No one thought about this except Elena, and she thought about it often. On the afternoon of June 21st, the rain began. It started as a gentle shower, the kind farmers welcomed for their corn and soybeans. But by evening, the sky had turned a bruised purple, and the rain was coming down in sheets so thick you couldn't see the barn from the farmhouse porch. The National Weather Service issued a flash flood watch at 8:17 p.m. They upgraded it to a warning at 11:45. Elena sat in her kitchen, listening to the battery-powered radio, watching the creek behind her property rise inch by inch. She pulled on her boots and walked to the barn. Barnaby was restless, packing his stall, his bad leg dragging but his eyes alert. He knew. At 1:52 a.m., a section of the Raven Creek Barrier's earthen embankment gave way. It wasn't a dramatic explosion, just a soft, wet slumping sound like a giant sighing in the dark. Then the water came. A wall of mud and debris 8 feet high tore through the spillway, sweeping away trees, boulders, and the maintenance shed where the floodgate controls were housed. The warning siren, designed to alert the town of a breach, shorted out in the first 30 seconds. Cedar Creek slept on, unaware. Elena heard it, the roar, a low, guttural growl that grew louder and closer, shaking the floorboards of her house. She ran to the window and saw the creek, her familiar, gentle creek surging like a living thing, already swallowing the lower pasture. She had 12 minutes, maybe less, before that water hit the town. Her truck was parked out front, but Highway 9 ran through the lowest part of the valley. She'd never make it. The only routes that stayed above the flood line were the high trails, the deer paths, the switchbacks, the routes she and Barnaby had traveled 1,000 times. She grabbed the old bridle hanging by the barn door. Her hands, knotted with arthritis, fumbled with the buckles. Barnaby stood perfectly still as she slipped the bit into his mouth, as if he understood exactly what was being asked. His fused knee would make every step agony. He was 23 years old. He hadn't galloped in a decade. And now Elena was going to ask him to run through black rain, through rising floodwaters, faster than he had ever moved in his life. She swung her leg over his scarred back, her 78-year-old body remembering a motion it hadn't performed with urgency in years. She leaned forward, pressed her lips to his ear, and whispered, "It's you and me, old friend. Nobody else can do this. Just you." Then she gave him his head, and Barnaby lurched forward into the storm, disappearing into the wall of rain and darkness as the roar of the flood grew deafening behind them. The rain struck Barnaby's face like buckshot as he plunged into the darkness. The trail ahead was invisible, swallowed by a curtain of water so dense it turned every familiar landmark into a shapeless shadow. But Barnaby didn't need eyes. He knew this path by the slope of the earth under his hooves, by the scent of the pines on the ridge, by the sound the wind made as it funneled through the narrow pass above the reservoir. His bad leg dragged on every uphill stride, a sickening hitch that made his whole body shudder. Elena felt every jolt travel up through her spine, her arthritic fingers twisted into his coarse mane. She could hear him breathing, a rasp that sounded too wet, too labored, but he didn't stop. Behind them, the Raven Creek Reservoir was emptying itself into the valley. A wall of water 30 feet high in some places was tearing out trees by their roots, rolling boulders like marbles, obliterating the maintenance road that ran along the creek bed. The noise was industrial, a grinding, crushing roar that made the air itself shake. Elena didn't look back. She kept her eyes fixed on the ridge ahead, the first waypoint on the route she had ridden 1,000 times in daylight and 100 times in darkness. If they could reach the old fire tower, they'd be above the flood line. From there, she could cut across the ridge to the upper meadow behind the schoolhouse. That was where the first families lived, the ones closest to the creek, the ones who would already be underwater if they didn't move now. Barnaby stumbled. His right foreleg, the one with the fused knee, caught on a submerged root, and he pitched forward with a cry that was half pain, half panic. Elena shifted her weight instantly, leaning back to keep him from going down completely, her thighs gripping the worn saddle with a strength she didn't know she still possessed. For a sickening second, the ground rushed up to meet them. Then Barnaby caught himself, heaving, his sides ballooning with desperate breaths. Elena pressed her cheek against his neck. "Not here, boy, not yet. Get us to the ridge." He climbed, one agonizing step after another, the mud sucking at his hooves, the rain blinding him. And in those moments, Elena's mind flickered through a gallery of memories she had buried. Charles, her husband, had been a civil engineer, one of the men who helped survey the original dam site in 1952. He told her things over dinner, quiet things about the soil composition, about the fault line that ran under the eastern abutment, about the reports that had been buried by county commissioners who didn't want to pay for repairs. After he died, Elena had kept his notebooks, his topographic maps, his handwritten warnings about what would happen if the dam ever failed at night. She'd memorized them, not because she expected to use them, but because they were all she had left of his voice. The town never asked her opinion. They saw a grieving widow shuffling through the grocery store, a woman who'd let her farm go to seed, who kept a lame horse out of stubborn sentiment. They didn't know she could recite the elevation of every ridge in the valley to the foot. They didn't know she'd planned for this night. The fire tower emerged from the rain like a skeleton. Its wooden stairs were rotten, the observation platform sagging, but the clearing around it was high and dry. Elena guided Barnaby into the clearing and finally allowed him to stop. He stood with his head drooping, steam rising from his drenched coat, his whole body trembling with exhaustion. Below them, the valley was a black abyss, but Elena could see the first flicker of catastrophe: headlights, cars on Highway 9 swerving, stopping, then turning back as the river of mud cascaded across the asphalt. The road was already gone in at least 2 places. Anyone trying to evacuate that way was trapped. She knew what she had to do. The town was laid out in 3 clusters: the lower village near the creek where the mill workers' cottages were, the main street where the stores and the tavern were, and the upper neighborhood by the school. The warning siren hadn't sounded. The phones were probably already dead from the storm. There was no one else. She nudged Barnaby forward, angling along the ridge toward the schoolhouse trail. Each minute she gained would save a family. Each minute she lost would cost one. The path along the ridge was narrower than she remembered. Decades of erosion had eaten away at the outer edge, leaving a ribbon of mud 2 feet wide with a sheer drop into the flood on the right. Barnaby walked it like a tightrope, his ears flat, his gait slow and deliberate. Elena felt the wind gust and leaned into it, counterbalancing. She didn't breathe. She didn't speak. She just held on. They reached the upper meadow at 2:38 a.m. The schoolhouse was dark, but the cluster of houses around it, the teacher's cottage, the Odell family's farmhouse, the trailer where the Hernandez brothers lived, were all silent, their inhabitants oblivious. Elena rode straight for the Odell's front door. She didn't dismount. She couldn't. If she got off Barnaby, her trembling legs might not get her back on. Instead, she leaned over, grabbed a rock from the ground, and hurled it at the wooden door with a force that made her shoulder scream. A light flickered. Mark Odell, a man built like a wood stove, yanked open the door with a curse on his lips that died when he saw the apparition before him. The old woman the whole town mocked, drenched and wild-eyed on her crippled horse, the floodwater already lapping at the edge of his property. "The dam broke," Elena said. "You have 5 minutes. Get your family up the ridge trail behind the school. Go now." Mark stared at her, processing. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. Elena didn't wait. She turned Barnaby and rode for the Hernandez trailer. Behind her, she heard Mark's voice erupt in a shout that broke the night. "Nancy, get the kids. Get the kids now." The years of ridicule, the whispers, the cruel nicknames, none of it mattered now. Barnaby limped at a trot through the rain, and the only people in Cedar Creek who had a chance were the ones who could hear the beat of his damaged hooves pounding on the mud. The Hernandez trailer sat on cinder blocks at the edge of the meadow, 50 yards from where the creek had once been, and was now a roaring brown serpent. Elena didn't throw rocks this time. She rode Barnaby straight up to the aluminum siding and pounded on it with her fist. The whole structure shook. A light came on inside, and 22-year-old Miguel Hernandez yanked open the door, his eyes squinting against the rain. When he saw Elena, his face contorted with confusion. This was the crazy horse lady, the one his buddies made jokes about at the gas station. What was she doing here in the middle of the night, looking like she'd crawled out of the creek itself? "Damn failed," Elena said, cutting through his disorientation. "Water's coming. Get your brother and run for the ridge behind the school." "Now, Miguel, there's no time." Miguel's confusion evaporated into something raw. He'd grown up hearing stories from his grandmother about floods in Guatemala, about walls of water that erased villages in seconds. He didn't argue. He turned and shouted for his brother, and within 30 seconds both young men were pulling on boots and grabbing the emergency bag their abuela had insisted they keep packed. Elena was already moving toward the teacher's cottage, but Miguel's voice stopped her. "What about the others? My aunt lives down on Mill Street. She's old. She can't run." Mill Street, the lower village, the lowest point in Cedar Creek, where the water from the broken dam would hit first and hardest. Elena's stomach clenched. She had planned to ride the ridge, warn the upper families, and trust that the lower village had some other warning, some miracle. But there was no miracle. The siren was dead. The phones were down. The only warning those people would get was her. Her mind raced through the topography. There was a goat path that dropped from the meadow down to the back of the mill, a steep descent that no horse in its right mind would attempt in dry daylight, let alone in a flood. It was the only shortcut. If she took the main trail down, the water would beat her by 5 minutes. But the goat path was a 40-degree slope of loose shale and exposed roots, and at the bottom was a narrow footbridge over the mill race, a bridge that was almost certainly already underwater. She looked at Barnaby. He was heaving, his nostrils flared wide, a pinkish foam beginning to fleck his lips. His fused joint had swollen to twice its normal size, the skin stretched tight and hot. He was done. Any other horse would have collapsed by now, but Barnaby was not any other horse. "Miguel," she said, "get your brother and the Odells and anyone else you find up the ridge. Keep moving until you reach the fire tower clearing. Do not stop, do not come looking for me, but go." She turned Barnaby toward the lip of the meadow where the goat path began its plunge. He hesitated. For the first time that night, he balked. The path was a black moor, the rain slashing sideways across it, and the roar of the flood below was now a living presence, a vibration that came up through the ground and into his bones. Elena leaned forward, her voice dropping to the same soft murmur she used when she groomed him in the quiet of the barn. "I know, boy, I know it's asking everything. But there are people down there who can't help themselves, old people, sick people, people who never gave you a kind word. But that's not why we do it. We do it because we can, and there's no one else." Barnaby's ear swiveled back toward her voice. For a long, trembling moment, he stood frozen at the edge of the descent. Then he took one step forward, and then another. And then they were sliding down the hill, his hindquarters bunched, his forelegs scrabbling for purchase on the loose stone, a controlled avalanche of horse and woman and mud that seemed to take forever and no time at all. Halfway down, the path narrowed to nothing, a washout where a section of the hillside had collapsed, leaving a raw scar of clay and exposed roots. There was no going around. There was no going back up. The only way forward was to jump the gap, a 6-foot void with the swollen creek roaring at the bottom. Barnaby gathered himself at the edge, his whole body coiled. Elena felt him sink back onto his haunches, felt the immense effort it took for him to shift his weight onto that ruined leg, and then he launched. For a sickening second, they were airborne, the water churning below, the rain stinging their faces. Then Barnaby's front hooves found the far side, scrabbling on the wet clay, and for one terrible heartbeat, Elena thought he was going to slide backwards into the void. She threw her weight forward over his neck, and the shift was just enough. He found his footing and surged upward, clearing the gap, and they were on solid ground again, the Millrace footbridge visible through the curtain of rain. The bridge was gone. The wooden planks that had spanned the Millrace for 60 years had been torn away by the rising water, leaving only the 2 stone abutments and a gap of churning brown foam. But Elena had known this would happen. She had memorized the valley's secrets, and one of those secrets was the old ford 50 yards upstream, where the Millrace widened and shallowed, a place where a horse could cross even in high water, if that horse was steady and his rider knew exactly where to step. She guided Barnaby upstream, feeling for the ford with every step, her boots sloshing in the stirrups as the water rose to Barnaby's belly, then to his chest. He didn't panic. He just kept moving, placing each hoof with the careful precision of an animal who had learned long ago that one wrong step meant disaster. The water seethed around them, full of debris, branches, a metal trash can, something that looked horribly like a child's bicycle. But Barnaby's hooves found the hidden gravel bar and they crossed, emerging on the far bank just as the Millrace became a single churning torrent behind them. They were on Mill Street now, the lower village. The floodwater here was already knee-deep and rising fast. The first house belonged to Ida Taggart, an 85-year-old widow who had lived alone since her son died in the Gulf War. Elena rode up to the porch, which was already awash, and shouted through the window. No response. She dismounted, her legs nearly buckling when she hit the ground, and waded up the steps, pounding on the door, still nothing. She tried the knob. It was unlocked. Inside, she found Ida sitting in her armchair, a battery lantern on the table beside her, her eyes wide with the glassy terror of someone who had heard the roar and knew she couldn't outrun it. She had resigned herself to dying in this chair. "Not today, Ida," Elena said, her voice somehow gentle and iron at the same time. She helped the older woman to her feet, guided her out onto the porch, and with an effort that made every joint in her body scream, boosted her onto Barnaby's back. The old gelding stood steady as a rock, even as the water crept up to his hocks. "Hold his mane," Elena said. "He'll get you to high ground." Ida's cracked voice quavered. "But you, I'm not finished yet." Elena took Barnaby's bridle and began leading him through the rising water, heading for the ridge trail that met Mill Street at its eastern end. They passed house after house, and at each one she shouted, pounded, broke windows if she had to. The Mill Street residents stumbled out into the flood. The Kowalski family with their 2 small children, old Mr. Pham, who ran the laundromat, Bonnie Lassiter, who was 8 months pregnant. Elena gathered them all, a bedraggled procession of the frightened and the fragile, and she pointed each one toward the ridge. "Follow the horse, he knows the way." She sent Barnaby ahead with Ida still clinging to his back, trusting that he would lead the group up the ridge trail to the fire tower, the same trail they had ridden an hour earlier, a trail he could walk in his sleep. Then she turned back toward the last house on Mill Street, the one closest to the creek, the one that the flood would swallow first. It was Tom Hartley's house, the feed store manager, the man who had called her a ghost and her horse a wreck, the man whose voice had carried across the general store every morning, dripping with condescension. She hadn't spoken to him directly in 15 years, but his words had reached her all the same, sharp little arrows that stuck in places she couldn't remove. Now his house was already listing, its foundation undermined by the water, and Tom was on the roof, clinging to the chimney, his face a mask of abject terror. He saw Elena wadding toward him, waist-deep in the flood, and his expression fractured into something that looked almost like hope and shame. "Help me," he gasped. "Please, I can't swim." Elena looked up at him, the water swirling around her, the rain plastering her grey hair to her skull. She was 78 years old. Her body was running on fumes. Her horse was somewhere on the ridge, leading a group of survivors to safety on legs that should have given out hours ago. And the man who had spent 2 decades making her feel worthless was now begging for her help. She held out her hand. "Get down, Tom. The water's rising faster. We have to move now." He slid down the sloped roof, his feet splashing into the water beside her. For a moment they stood there, the flood up to their chests, the roar of the dam still echoing through the valley. Tom's eyes met hers, and she saw the words he couldn't say, the apology, the gratitude, the crushing weight of his own cruelty. She didn't need to hear them. She just grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the ridge, half dragging him through the debris-filled water as the last house on Mill Street groaned and collapsed behind them into the torrent. They reached the ridge trail just as the flood claimed the entire lower village. Behind them, Mill Street disappeared beneath a churning brown lake, the roofs of houses popping like wooden corks before being swept away. In front of them, a ragged line of survivors was climbing toward the fire tower, led by a limping chestnut horse with an old woman clinging to his mane. The sun had not yet risen, but the eastern sky was beginning to pale, a thin gray line that promised dawn. Elena staggered up the trail, Tom's arm over her shoulder, and when she finally reached the clearing by the fire tower and saw her neighbors, dozens of them, cold and terrified but alive, she collapsed to her knees. Barnaby was there. He turned his great head, his dark eyes finding her even in the gloom, and a low nicker rumbled in his chest. He had done it. They had done it. The town of Cedar Creek had been given 12 minutes, and by every reasonable measure, it should have been destroyed. But the math of survival isn't always reasonable. Sometimes it includes a woman the world discarded, a horse the world called broken, and a lifetime of quiet preparation that no one bothered to notice. As the sun rose over the flooded valley, the survivors huddled together in the fire tower clearing, and one by one, they began to understand exactly who had saved them, and exactly how wrong they had been. Dawn broke over a valley that had been reshaped overnight. The water had carved new channels through farmland, uprooted century-old oaks, and left a coat of brown silt over everything below the ridge line. From the fire tower clearing, the survivors looked down at a world that no longer matched their memories. The lower village was gone. The mill, the feed store, the general store with its coffee pot and its cruel jokes, all of it sat under 15 feet of muddy water. 1,200 people lived in Cedar Creek. By the time the rescue helicopters arrived from the state capitol at 10 that morning, the count began. The final tally would not be known for days, but as the sun climbed higher and the survivors huddled together for warmth, a grim arithmetic was already taking shape. The death toll was 17. 17 souls lost to the Raven Creek flood, neighbors, friends, people who hadn't heard the warning in time. But the number that stunned the rescue teams, the number that made the state disaster coordinator pull out a notepad and start asking very specific questions, was the other figure. 1,183 people had made it to high ground before the water reached them. In a valley where the official evacuation plan had failed completely, where the siren never sounded and the road washed out in the first minutes, nearly every resident of Cedar Creek was alive, and that made no sense to anyone who understood the physics of dam failures. The explanation arrived on a stretcher. Elena Vance had collapsed shortly after reaching the fire tower clearing. The adrenaline that had carried her through the night had finally spent itself, and her 78-year-old body simply shut down. A paramedic who hiked up the ridge trail found her lying on the ground with her head resting against Barnaby's flank. The old horse was standing guard over her, his legs trembling, his eyes half closed with exhaustion. He had not moved from her side since the last survivor reached the clearing. When the paramedic tried to approach, Barnaby pinned his ears and planted himself between the stranger and Alina's prone form. It took Miguel Hernandez, kneeling in the mud and speaking in a low, steady voice, to coax the horse back long enough for the medics to reach her. Alina was airlifted to Mercy Regional Hospital with a fractured rib, severe hypothermia, and a heart arrhythmia that the doctors said should have killed her hours earlier. She spent 3 days in intensive care, drifting in and out of consciousness, unaware that the story of what she had done was already spreading far beyond the flooded valley. The first news crews arrived by midday, picking their way through the debris to interview survivors. And every survivor told the same story. An old woman on a lame horse appeared out of the storm like a ghost, knocking on doors, shouting warnings, getting people to a trail that no one else knew existed. "She saved us," Ida Taggart told a television reporter, her voice still quavering but her eyes fierce. "That woman they all laughed at. She saved every last one of us." The story landed in the national news cycle with the force of a revelation. Here was a woman who had been dismissed, mocked, rendered invisible by her community, and she had repaid their cruelty with courage. The irony was not lost on anyone. Headlines ran in papers from coast to coast. The town that mocked her was saved by her horse. A broken horse and an old woman, the unlikely heroes of Cedar Creek. They laughed at her until the flood came. Commentators on cable news debated whether the town owed her an apology or a monument. Social media erupted with the hashtag Alina and Barnaby, and within 48 hours, a fundraiser to rebuild the town in their honor had raised over $3 million. But the real reckoning was happening in the Fire Tower clearing, where the survivors waited for rescue and grappled with the weight of their own past behavior. Tom Hartley sat apart from the group, his back against a pine tree, his face buried in his hands. He had not spoken since Alina pulled him from his roof. The words he had said over the years, "There goes the ghost and her wreck," looped in his mind like a recording he could not shut off. He had said those words to his customers, to his friends, to his own children. He had made Alina Vance a punchline. And she had waded through chest-deep floodwater to save his life without a moment's hesitation. He was not alone in his shame. Bonnie Lassiter, the pregnant woman Alina had guided to the ridge, remembered laughing along with the jokes at the general store because it was easier to blend in than to stand up. Mark Odell remembered seeing Alina at the post office and deliberately looking away so he wouldn't have to exchange pleasantries with a woman everyone considered odd. The Kowalskis remembered telling their children not to stare at the strange old lady with the crippled horse, as if her condition might be contagious. One by one, the survivors began to confess these small cruelties to each other, and in the confessing, a collective understanding began to form. They had not been innocent bystanders. They had been participants in a quiet, persistent cruelty that had lasted for 20 years, and the woman they had persecuted had saved them anyway. When Alina finally woke in her hospital bed, her first words were not about herself. They were about Barnaby. "Where is my horse?" she asked the nurse, her voice a dry rasp. "Is he alive? Is he okay?" Barnaby was alive. He had been transporting to the state veterinary hospital, where a team of equine specialists worked on him through the night. The initial assessment was grim. His fused knee had developed a severe septic infection from the trauma of the night's exertion. His heart, already weakened by age, showed signs of stress cardiomyopathy, essentially a heart attack brought on by extreme physical effort. The vets gave him a 30% chance of survival. The reporter who broke that news on the evening broadcast received a record number of calls from viewers demanding that every resource be devoted to saving him. The fundraiser that had started for the town quickly pivoted. Donations poured in earmarked specifically for Barnaby's care. A specialist from the top veterinary school in the country volunteered to fly in and consult. Within a week, Barnaby's chances had improved to 50-50, then to 70-30, then to guarded optimism. But here is the detail that no one expected. During Barnaby's examination, the veterinary team discovered something that had been hidden for 17 years. The fused joint in his knee was not a congenital defect or an old injury that had healed poorly. It was the result of a surgical procedure, a T-plate implant inserted into the bone, a technique developed for performance horses who needed to return to competition after catastrophic fractures. Barnaby had not been a random rescue from a kill pen. He had been a highly trained search and rescue horse, one of a specialized group bred and conditioned for mountain operations. His limp had masked a body that remembered everything. The military brand on his inner thigh, faded and nearly invisible under his coat, confirmed it. He had served with a mountain rescue unit in the Rockies for 8 years, retiring after his injury, then passing through a series of owners who didn't recognize his training or his value until he wound up at a kill pen where Alina found him for $120. The revelation reframed everything. Barnaby had not simply been a loyal companion carrying his owner through a flood. He had been a dormant expert, a machine designed for exactly this kind of disaster, waiting for 17 years for the moment when his training would be needed again. And Alina, without knowing it, had recognized something in him that no one else had seen: the quiet competence, the steady nerve, the refusal to quit. She had saved him, and when the time came, he had saved her. He had saved them all. The town of Cedar Creek rebuilt slowly over the following year. The state finally released the inspection reports that had been buried, and the county engineer whose desk they had languished on resigned in disgrace. A class action lawsuit was filed and settled. New flood protocols were written, new sirens installed, new evacuation routes mapped. But the most visible change in Cedar Creek was not administrative. It was a bronze statue erected in the town square, paid for entirely by donations from the survivors. The statue did not depict a general or a politician or a founding father. It depicted a woman in her 70s, her hair loose and windblown, sitting bareback on a horse whose right foreleg was slightly bent. The woman's face was turned upward toward the ridge, as if she was still scanning the darkness for a safe path forward. The horse's expression was calm, patient, enduring. On the base of the statue was a single word: believe. Alina lived to see the statue dedicated. She attended the ceremony in a wheelchair, her body still recovering from the strain of that night. Barnaby stood beside her, his leg heavily bandaged, but his eyes as bright and steady as they had ever been. He had survived, against all odds, and had been officially retired from all labor, living out his remaining years in a custom barn built by the grateful community on Alina's rebuilt farm. When Alina was asked to speak, she declined at first, uncomfortable with the attention. But the crowd would not stop applauding, and finally she allowed herself to be wheeled to the microphone. She spoke for less than a minute. She thanked the community for honoring Barnaby. She said she had only done what anyone would do, and then she said something that silenced the crowd. "I knew the dam would fail," she said. "My husband told me 40 years ago. I spent my whole life preparing for a night everyone said would never come. I didn't do it to be a hero. I did it because I loved him, and I loved this valley, and I couldn't bear to see either one destroyed. The crowd was silent for a long moment. Then, from somewhere in the back, a single voice began to clap. It was Tom Hartley, his face wet with tears, standing alone by the statue. One by one, the others joined him, until the applause was a thunder that rolled up the valley and echoed off the ridge where Elena and Barnaby had ridden through the darkness, carrying salvation on 4 scarred legs. The story of Elena Vance and Barnaby is not ultimately about a flood. It is about the quiet catastrophe that happens every day in towns like Cedar Creek all over the world, the catastrophe of being unseen. For 20 years, a woman with the knowledge to save an entire community walked its streets, and no one asked her a single question. For 17 years, a horse with elite rescue training stood in a field nibbling grass, and no one wondered what he might be capable of. Their heroism did not emerge despite decades of ridicule. It was forged in those decades, in the silent refusal to become what the world told them they were. We all live among the dismissed, the neighbor whose opinions we never seek, the animal we consider a burden because it moves too slowly or costs too much to feed, the colleague whose quietness we mistake for irrelevance. We build our assessments on surfaces, age, appearance, a hitch in the gate, and we rarely consider what lies beneath. Elena Vance knew the elevation of every ridge in that valley to the foot, and she knew it because a lifetime of grief had given her nothing to do but pay attention. Barnaby had muscle memory trained into him by professionals, and it lay dormant only because no one had asked him to use it. How many other Elenas and Barnabys are out there, waiting for their moment, dismissed because they don't look like heroes? The next time you see someone the world has labeled useless, an elderly woman shuffling through a store, a broken-down animal limping across a field, ask yourself what they might know that you don't, what maps they've drawn, what nights they've prepared for, because the flood always comes eventually in one form or another, and when it does, the ones you ignored may be the only ones who can show you the way to high ground. If this story moved you, leave a comment below and tell us about someone the world underestimated who proved everyone wrong. We read every single one, and if you believe in second chances, for people, for animals, for the quiet ones among us, subscribe to this channel and hit the bell. We tell stories about the moments that change everything, and you won't want to miss what's coming next.